Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. Thank you for zooming in from wherever you are. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. Really honored and pleased today to have a one-on-one conversation with one of the more interesting and fascinating and educational and valuable members of Global Chamber, and that's Zach Selch. He's the VP of Global Sales at PharmaJet, but he's got a program around sales mentoring and a sales mentoring site that's really valuable, full of resources, full of videos. He's got a wide range of experiences. He's a fun character. And so we thought it would be great to just have a one-on-one conversation with Zach, because what he knows about, almost every company screws up, and that is international sales. And I count myself as that as well. Somebody who has, 30 years of experience and managed and selected distributors around the world and pulled my hair out. I used to have dark hair. I can't believe it, but it's all turned gray because of my mismanagement and my inability to know the stuff that Zach knows. And so Zach, really appreciate you taking the time today. And why don't we kick things off maybe by you giving us some information to start the conversation, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. I have a series of questions where I'd love to do a little bit more of a deep dive. And so please go ahead and kind of maybe start the conversation with some things that you feel are important on the topic.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for that introduction. That was really, really kind of you. And yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. This was something I decided I wanted to do. Strangely enough, really, when I was a kid, I really wanted to see the world. And I realized this was a way to do it, that if you really knew how to sell and you were good at dealing with other cultures, you could always get a job being an international sales manager. And over the years, I've figured out that a lot of people don't know how to do this. And I don't mean to be like insulting to people, or I don't want to sound abrasive about it, but what happens is it's a very physically challenging job very often, and people do it for a couple of years. You make it to be a global sales manager, and by that time you've been working for a while, and then it's easy to pop from there to be something else. And so people do it, and they don't necessarily save that information, and that information disappears from the organizational memory. So very often people, like you said, screw it up. And it really is, it's the best way to add value to a company. If you grow the international footprint of a company, let's say you have a company that sells in America $100 million, and the value of that company might be $250 or $300 million. If you grow your domestic sales by $10 million or $20 million, you might not even shift the value of the company. But if you go from $1 million internationally to $20 million internationally, you might suddenly add $100 or $200 million to that value of the company, because now it's an international company. It's a multinational company, right? So it is a hugely important thing. On the other hand, if you do it wrong, there have been a couple of really good studies in the past decade that document that if you do this wrong, you can sink the company. There's a Harvard Business Review and a UCLA doctorate paper that both talked about when people make mistakes trying to expand internationally, it's the most expensive mistake they can make. And what happens is they get pulled all sorts of different directions, they waste resources, and they can really weaken their company. So doing it right has huge advantages. Doing it wrong has huge disadvantages. And yet very often what you see with companies is they put in place somebody who, it's hard to find somebody who knows your product, who you feel comfortable with, and yet knows how to sell internationally. And we always overestimate how international we are and how multicultural we are and how well we know how to sell, right? Those are things that are very common for people to overestimate. And if you take a look, I have a lot of friends who are international sales managers. I know a lot of international sales managers. If you take a look at them, a lot of them, they were a good regional manager. You know, they were the best Midwest regional sales manager for their company. And somebody said to them, hey, do you want to be the international sales manager? You spent junior year in Mexico. Your Spanish is pretty good. Why don't you become the international sales manager? And then it's sink or swim. And some of them do really, really well, and they figure it out on their own, and they figure things out. And some of them sink because nobody's there to give them help. So, you know, what are some of these big mistakes? Well, first of all, it's choosing who is going to be the guy or the person who runs your international sales program. Very often, again, we're looking for somebody we trust. We're looking for somebody who knows our product, and finding somebody who knows international sales and knows our product and we're comfortable with, well, that can be really difficult, right? So finding the right person is very hard, and then there's nobody to support them. So that's probably the first mistake people make, is they choose somebody, you know, the wrong person to do this, right? And that's very understandable, but you're dealing with a limited pool. And how do you find somebody? Now, the thing is, what you're looking for is somebody with experience in selling to multiple markets, maybe not exactly your product, but have they actually sold to multiple markets? Have they built an international sales organization? And there are lots of people out there who have done that. They're probably just not somebody you know personally, or somebody who has experience in your specific product. So finding somebody like that can really, really help you out. And then probably the next mistake that people make is where they decide to go into. And this also ties up to the fact that, are they doing this with real intent? Are they thinking this through? I talk to people all the time at trade shows and in business places all over the world. And we'll say, well, what are the markets you're expanding into? And they'll go, oh, you know, the obvious ones, France, Italy, and Japan. And I always say, if a company tells me the first 3 markets they're going into are France, Italy, and Japan, they're going to fail, because they've chosen those markets because their wife wants to go on vacation to those places, not because there's any business reason for it, right? And why do I say that? I can't think of any product probably, except for maybe a high-end kitchen tool, that would sell in those 3 markets better than other places, right? Usually, if you're selling a widget, you're going to find that your top markets are going to be places like, you know, Croatia, Pakistan, and Korea, or something like that, right? And so basically what you really want to do is look carefully. And what do I mean by looking carefully? Well, figure out why people buy your product, figure out who buys your product, at what point, what is there a triggering event or something like that that gets people to buy your product, and then try and figure out where there are markets that are like that, right? Can you identify, you know, for instance, let's say you have a product that typically is bought by families of childbearing years, right? So take a look at the demographics and find the countries where they have the largest number of families, you know, of growth of childbearing year families, for instance. Or are people in the middle class driving the purchase of your product, right? Or are people, you know, I sold a product once years ago where it complemented very well a product. In the beginning, we thought we were competing with this product. And then what we realized was our customers would buy this other product, and then a year later, they would buy our product to go along with it. They wouldn't buy our product first, but they would buy it afterwards. And that the main manufacturer of this other product was a publicly traded company. So it was easy to buy one, to buy a share of their company, get their annual report, see where they were selling, and that told me what markets were going to be good for me. So, you know, those type of things, you want to think about where you want to go, because every market you go into is expensive. You know, it's effort, it's time, it's money. And if you go into markets that don't pay off, you're going to lose something. On the other hand, you don't want to focus on 1 or 2 markets. You want to spread your risk. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Now, you might not go into 50 countries at once, but I'm going to tell you, if you go into like 2 or 3 markets at once, a single weather event, a single political event can sink your whole effort. And then you come back and you say, oh, well, we tried international, it didn't work, we gave up on it. And for instance, a few years ago, there was a huge drop in oil prices. And at that point, about 40 to 50% of my revenue with my company was coming from oil producing countries. And I knew that if oil prices dropped, now I didn't have any reason to believe that oil prices would drop. I'm not a prophet. I don't really understand commodity markets or anything like that. But I knew that if all of my customers had their economies linked to the same thing, I was putting myself in danger. So I made sure to spread my risk so that when the oil price dropped, I could work towards building up sales in other markets. And that way the company didn't suffer too much, right? So you don't want to put your eggs in one basket too much. So those are the biggest mistakes I would say people make is, choosing the head of your international sales, figuring out what markets you go into. And I'm going to tie this up a little bit to how you get advised about this, right? And I always sort of joke, I have this story when I was a little kid, I tried to play the saxophone. I was a horrible saxophone player and I took lessons. And I came home one day and I said to my mother, my teacher says that if I were to buy a new saxophone, I could play much better. And my mother said, great, how much is that? And I said, $1,000. And my mother said, how does your saxophone teacher make her money? And I said, well, she gives lessons. And my mother says, yeah, we pay her $7 an hour to teach you saxophone. How else does she make money? And I said, well, she sells saxophones, right? So, my mother said, okay, so always question how people make their money before you do business with them. And what do I mean by that? There are lots and lots and lots of people out there who are global advisors on selling internationally, right? And if you talk to somebody whose specialty is Japan, I can virtually guarantee you they will tell you the best market to go into is Japan. If you talk to somebody whose specialty is making technical changes to your widget to make it, sellable in new markets, they will tell you, you really should go into Germany, but we have to change the dimensions and I can do that work for you, right? So take a look carefully at how people are advising you. I was at a conference a while back, and this woman asked a question. There were a few people on stage, there were diplomats. And this woman said, okay, I only have money to go into one Middle Eastern market. Which market should I go into? And this diplomat on stage said, well, we just signed this new treaty with Morocco, which allows you to repatriate your money more easily, so you won't pay double taxation. So if I were you, I'd go into Morocco. And I raised my hand. I said, the medical device market in Saudi Arabia is 10 times as big as the medical device market in Morocco. Are you saying that this treaty is more valuable than 90% of actual revenue? Is that your position on this? And the diplomat said, well, no, I guess if you're thinking about revenue, then maybe. I said, of course we're thinking about revenue. We are salespeople. We are thinking about revenue, right? You're a diplomat. You don't care about revenue. We want revenue, right? And that's, my wife says that's why they don't invite me to more parties. But that's really, like, you got to think, do you have an advisor who is going to help you generate revenue, or are they going to generate more hourly billing for themselves? And those are really the big things that are going to help you expand internationally. So that I can jump into questions now, or I can say one more thing, Doug. I'm coming out with a book in September, which is a 200 and some page book. It's a manual on how to be an international sales manager. And I'm going to offer it to members of the Global Chamber at a hugely discounted price for the e-version of it. And it really, I spent a lot of time putting what I've learned for the past 30 years into it, down to things like how to interview regional managers and how to choose distributors and all those little details. And I really did it because I wanted to spread this information out there. I think there's a huge lack of information in this field with a lot of people doing this job. And I'm hoping that we can, you know, help make this something that's easier for people to get done and do right. Do you want me to keep talking, Doug, or do you want to throw questions at me, or where do we stand?
I've got some questions. Absolutely. You've got my head both spinning and running, so it's really great. And you'll feel free to elaborate on any of the things that come up in the next stage. I do want to say that there were several things there that really resonated with me personally, because I was one of those people that got selected for a regional sales role across of Asia for the Teflon business. And it was only because the previous guy retired and nobody wanted his job. Right. So it kind of goes to several things that you pointed to there. We almost
all start that way. And then the question is, you know, either you sink or you swim, and a lot of people sink, you know, that's the thing. You got to start someplace, right?
Well, the other part of what you said really, again, resonated is, first of all, you're thrown into the role and you've not had the experience, right? You're doing your best. And where do you go to learn, right? There's no place other than maybe to talk to some other people, but they have other things. They almost never have all of the things that you need. The other part of it is that's really important is that you said, I thought, was the support structure. Where is the support structure? Almost always the business is run, let's say it's a US business, the people have US heads. And so the US sales team will always dominate the conversation because the leader of the business might have to go to Ohio, but might not have to go to Morocco to deal with a customer one-on-one. So if there is like a decision that needs to happen in the business, should I sell in Morocco or the US, which does sometimes come up, right, with different products or allocations or things like that, you're stuck as a regional manager and you now have to defend the business or whatever. So I don't know what the solution to that is because I never quite figured it out. I just was always very passionate about leading from that the international was critically important. I mean, how do you convince a CEO who is mainly a US person that international matters?
Well, so I've been I guess I've been a combination of lucky and unlucky because I've been in companies where they weren't terribly convinced. And I've been in companies where, you know, the basic idea was, well, what we really want to do is sell this company. And the way to do that is to grow the international footprint, right? And then it's really, okay, we have to do this. Now, what typically then happens is it's sort of like people will say the definition of crazy is trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So obviously people say, yes, Zach, please grow our business, but don't change anything. You know, we don't want you to change anything. And then you have to convince people. And what's really interesting with this is, like with any sales operation, it's small incremental changes, right? You don't come in, typically you don't come in and say, oh yeah, you didn't flip this switch and that's why there aren't any sales, right? You come in and you say, wow, there are 75 things here that each have to be adjusted a little bit in order to really drive international sales. And then you're going through them and everybody will fight you on each one of them because they say, well, why do you need to change the language on our advertising material, right? Like, again, very often you come into a company and it's less so much today because of diversity, but you'll come into a company and all the advertising material, all the people on it will be middle-aged white men. And you say, okay, I am selling in Nigeria and Indonesia. I would like to have a little diversity on the pictures, right? That kind of thing. Little things, but it's also operational things. It's, do we have somebody who's answering the phones at the right times of day, right? Those type of things. And then you go through and you're literally, typically every time I've been in this job with anybody, it's a constant argument over little things, because you say, you know, if somebody is calling from Germany and, you know, we have 2 receptionists in the factory, and somebody said it would be really nice if they could go to lunch together so they have somebody to talk to at lunch. Okay, so our phone is now not working between noon and 1 every day. What happens if somebody calls us from Asia or from Europe and they don't understand why we're not answering our phone, right? Those type of things. And that's, like I said, that's a really, really little example, but you end up with dozens or hundreds of those type of things. And you have to go through and say, well, what is going to make the customer experience easier, flow more smoothly, that kind of thing. And it really, you know, can very often be a fight like that, you know, but that's what happens. And again, I have a lot of different stories about this because there's a pattern. You come in and you say, well, this is going to take 12 months, maybe 15 months. Then we're going to see a surge in sales. And then you spend the first year, you know, I was with a company once, and probably there were 6 or 8 people who really, and not because of they were bad or, you know, they tried to undermine me constantly because they didn't understand what I was trying to do. And for the first year or so, I was constantly dealing, you know, there was this woman who'd come in and she'd say, you know, my dad is from Sweden and he thinks what, you know, I told him what you were doing and he thought it was a mistake. And I'm like, you know, what do I say to that? Right. But after a year, sales suddenly surged. And I said to my CEO, I was like, you just got to wait a few more months. I told you it would be the 15-month mark before things changed. And then then, you know, sales surged. And then what happened was suddenly we had, you know, a 50 or 60% increase in sales. And by the second or third year, we had gotten to like 300% sales increase. And then nobody can argue with that, right? Those are numbers. But it's that first bit where you're fighting every inch of the way that can be really difficult.
So really at that point, you've got to have top level buy-in to what you're doing, and to have not just the patience, but also to clear the way on countless numbers. Because you're absolutely right. There's so many different little things, pricing, and there's a million and one things that you need support with that people fight all the time. So you have to have that upper level support, right?
Right. You have to have upper level support. And what I would also do is I would do 2 things. I would have a pizza party once a year where I'd bring in my whole international team, and I would buy a whole bunch of pizza, and I would invite everybody to our like training center at the factory. I'd say, come in, you know, open house between 11 and 1. Everybody's invited, come in. And they would get to know the international salespeople, and we would do like a very, very short running presentation about things like time zones, right? Because you would get somebody at the shipping dock in Illinois who didn't quite understand time zones. And you would say, yeah, you know, the reason we're trying to load this early in the morning is because, you know, in Indonesia, it's actually the middle of the night, you know. And when they understood it and they got a piece of pizza out of it, they'd be like, oh, that's cool. I understand now, Zach, right? And the other thing is I would carry around these little tokens, these pieces of paper, and they were like good for 1 free drink. And when somebody helped out the international team, I would give them one right away. And then once a year, I would have a party where my sales team was in the country, so they could go out drinking with the sales team. And here's the deal. I would give out, you know, 200 of these slips of paper, and I would end up redeeming 50 or 60 of them, right? But everybody loved getting them. And they would feel like, I would say, you really helped out the international team. You know, here you go. Thank you so much. And they would feel part of it. So, you know, it was just trying to tie them together, because there's so much friction sometimes between this, you know. People would say, I just don't understand why they want us to change our pallets. Why are they being so annoying about that? Everybody else, I say, yes, everybody in America uses wooden pallets. It is illegal to import a wooden pallet into these 6 countries. So they're complaining about it because they can't do it, right? The stuff gets stopped in customs. Yes, that is, you know, it's not that they're being a pain in the butt. It's illegal, right? We have to work with them, you know? So stuff like that, right?
No question. So one of the things that you also touched on that brought some memories back was the growth mentality versus the stability mentality. And I was in a bigger company, and so
Right.
there were a lot of managers that were really good at just managing things just so that nothing blows up. But you're talking about something quite a bit different, aren't you, in terms
Oh
of
yeah,
going
like,
from point nothing to something?
right. So I like to grow things, right? And I talk about, you know, you take a look at my LinkedIn, and the first word there, I think, is driving explosive growth, right? I'm about growth. I always, you know, and typically you don't want me around if you don't want to grow. And I don't mean that I don't mean that in a funny sense. It's just, if you basically say, okay, what we really need to do is grow, and then after we've hit, you know, $100 million, what we really want to do is stabilize for the next 5 years, and then, you know, I'm going to retire or something like that, then you don't want me around for that second half, and that's perfectly fine. But you have to get there, and a lot of companies are in different stages, and you know, there are reasons why a company would want to slow down their growth. But if you really want to grow, the best way to grow is to grow your internationals. If you're selling, you know, 2% or 5% of your total sales are international, and you have a reasonable market share in a country like the United States or like Germany or like Australia, where people want a good product, you can grow, right? Because if you have a product that is good enough to have a 20% market share in the United States, you can sell in a dozen other countries around the world. You could double your sales like that, right? If you do it correctly. So the question is, do you really want to grow? Now, very often you get to the point where you have solid market share in the United States, and it is hard to grow. You have 3 good, solid competitors with good products. You're doing really well, but now you're butting heads with good competitors, and maybe internationally now you can really grow, and you can grow the value of your company dramatically. Right. And that's, I think, what I'm all about. Right. And obviously there are companies that, and I don't mean this in a joking way, but there are companies that have very good reasons why they don't want to necessarily grow that quickly. But if that's what they want to do, if what you want to do is to grow the value of your company, in America right now, there are thousands of manufacturing companies that were founded around World War II or right after World War II or right before World War II, and they're now at 3rd generation. And if you are, you know, 60 years old and you're running your grandfather's widget company, and it's a $50 million company in sales, you know, you could sell it, you know, your kids don't want to take it over, but you're about to retire in a few years, the best way that you can grow the value of that company and then sell it and retire is to grow internationally, right? So for people like that, that is exactly the right fit, right? Spend 5 years growing the value of your company, double the value of your company by growing the international footprint. And then instead of leaving your kids $100 million, you leave your family $250 million, right? And that's doable if you want to really grow internationally. You just have to be willing to do what it takes.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a question that ties into something you'd said earlier and also what you just covered, and that is the market analysis that you use to be able to determine which are the countries. You somewhat kind of picked off kind of in general, but when you get involved with a project, what are the analytics that you use, and how do you go about determining not only the countries, but the order and how that all works out?
Oh, that's a great question. I love doing that. So What I always say, and this is sort of funny, I always say, okay, the first step is you really got to ask yourself some deep questions like, why do people buy my product? When do they buy my product? Who buys my product? And I always joke and say, you know, when I say that, everybody gets up to get a cup of coffee because they say, oh, Zach, I don't want to ask myself questions. I want you to tell me what to do, right? But the thing is, you really have to understand those questions because, you know, every product you can take a look and you can figure out why, when, how people are buying it. And that will drive you into the direction of the markets because, you know, it's very easy for, you know, again, I talk to people all the time and they say, oh, I just read this article about the Indian market and it's giant. So maybe I should go to India. And I'm like, okay, well, why would Indians want to buy your product? And they go, oh, it doesn't matter. There are a billion of them. Of course, somebody is going to buy my product, right? And the question is this a good fit? Maybe Belgium is a better fit. It's much smaller, but maybe everybody in Belgium will want your product and nobody in India is going to want your product, right? So if you take a look, and what do I mean by that? So let's take a couple of examples. So I sold a product once, which was a ventilator, and the original design engineer, the designer of the product, thought it was going to be a ventilator for ambulances. And it was a really nice, solid ventilator with a 6-hour battery, but it wasn't terribly feature rich. Now, what happened was, in most of the Western world, in Germany, in England, in the United States, in Canada, in most of the industrial countries, ambulances have very good electrical systems. So they don't need a ventilator with a battery. On the other hand, there are specific specifications they do need that we didn't have. On the other hand, there are countries that have poor electrical supply. So what we found was we sold huge numbers in places like Nigeria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, different places in Africa, India, because the critical care hospitals were saying, I need a ventilator that if power goes out for 3 hours, the ventilator will keep going, right? So it was basically saying, well, why do people actually buy my product? They buy my product because it's a critical care ventilator that will run if the electricity stops. So let's look for countries that need something like that, where the electricity isn't stable. I sold a product once that was very attractive to new middle-class people, okay? It made your hospital stay a little bit more comfortable. And what happened was you would take a look and you'd say, okay, so a place like Germany, you know, when you take a look at healthcare, you say, okay, so in Germany in 1970, they didn't have enough ventilators. Then they, you know, over the 70s, they got enough ventilators. They got enough, all of the critical care stuff they needed, they had. And then they started making hospital stays more comfortable. And now they have everything they need in terms of critical care products and in terms of, you know, making the stay comfortable. But let's say you go to a place like Turkey. They just got through the stage where they have enough ventilators, and now they're making the hospital stay more comfortable. They have this huge growing middle class. If you take a look at the demographics of Turkey, there's this giant wave of growing middle class, right? So the middle class people whose parents and grandparents were farmers, now they want to have better, more comfortable hospital stays. And that was a great market for me. So I would follow the markets that had a growing middle class and a certain number, you know, a certain number of people. The product I sell now, I sell to countries where the GDP is below a certain level, but the number of population is above a certain number. And those are the markets I target. What I like to do is I basically bunch together countries. So I say, I don't want to sell in, you know, probably the worst thing that can happen to a company is to find you have an installed base in, say, Venezuela, Nigeria, and Indonesia, right? Because trying to service those places would be really difficult. But let's say you say, okay, Peru is a fantastic potential market for me. Colombia is an okay market. Chile is an okay market. But if I work with the three of them together, I'm going to cut down my cost of travel. I'm going to cut down my cost of sales. So why don't I work with 4 countries in Latin America? I'll work with 4 countries in Africa. I'll work with 4 countries in Asia. And by doing that, they might not all be my top level target countries, but I'm cutting down on my cost per day in market. I'm cutting down on my cost of making sales. And that's typically the way I like to work. The one thing I'm going to tell you is I never, ever, ever go into a market because somebody walks up to me at a trade show and says, hey, I think you should be selling in Guyana, right? Because that is, you know, and typically when people say to me, oh, I have a great, I'm doing really good. Every place I'm selling, it's because I had a customer first. And then what typically happens is people will come up to you, they'll say, yes, I want to buy one of your units. I want to buy a demo unit. I want to be your distributor. But you don't know if you're ever going to see any more sales, but now you're committed. You're committing resources to those markets, right? You're tied into those markets. Maybe you have to do regulatory, all this stuff, and you have less time and money to aim at the markets that might produce more. So, you know, that, and you see this a lot, like every company I've ever gone into, you have markets that make absolutely no sense. And you typically have to extract yourself from those markets, or you have to fix it somehow. But, and every story is, yeah, this really nice guy walked up to us at a trade show, wanted to buy a demo unit, and we gave him a distribution agreement. And then you're tied up, and it can impact you legally, it can impact your reputation. You know, selling to the wrong country is a lot worse than no sales at all.
That makes a lot of sense. How do you decide between direct and indirect selling?
I am a big indirect sales guy, right? I would almost say that if you are under $500 million, you just want to work with channels. That's pretty much, it is so expensive to work direct that it's not even funny. Now, if, for instance, you sell to governments, so you only have one, you know, you could say, well, I only sell to governments, so really I'm dealing with one customer in each country, and I'm only going to sell to 5 or 6 countries, so we can afford to do this direct. That makes sense. But typically going direct, in my opinion, is a mistake. Now, the problem in my mind, the worst thing you can do is do what I call a hybrid system. And I know, I know a lot of people do it, right? And a lot of people have been very successful at it. But to me, when you have both direct and indirect, your channel partners are never going to trust you, because they're always going to understand that you could go direct and try and cheat them, right? No matter how honest you are with them, it's always going to be in the back of their mind. That's my opinion. Now, I like to be able to say to people, look, I have never, you know, go on LinkedIn, find 20 of my old distributors and ask them if I ever screwed them over, right? I have never gone from indirect to direct in any market in 30 years. You can trust me, right? And my distributors trust me, and they throw everything in, they market, they build my brand. I can trust them because they can trust me. The first time you ever screw over, the world is a small place. If you screw over a distributor, you might as well, you know, change careers. You might as well get a McDonald's franchise or something, right? Because you're done selling internationally in your field. Somebody is going to hear about you screwing over that distributor. And then people are going to talk about it, and it's going to be really hard getting past that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So indirect means selecting and then managing distributors. And so it sounds like you've got a whole methodology around doing that.
As a matter of fact, I do, Doug. So yeah, for me, this is something I've been doing my whole life, and you figure it out. So First of all, you talk to somebody and he calls his distributors his customers, you know he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? I'd say that's the big first thing is people will say, oh yeah, I've been working with this customer for 20 years. And you're like, he is not your customer. He is your channel partner. And why do I say that? Because he's an independent businessman, but he's also your sales asset. And you have to understand that. And then the other mistake is people will say, well, I have channels in place. I signed them up and now they're going to just send me in purchase orders and I'm good, right? But now your work's just started. You have to onboard them. You have to train them. You have to keep, mind share with them. You have to manage them. You have to get them to give you information, all these things. And this is the difference between $1 million in sales and $25 million in sales, right? If you go out and you sign up a half dozen distributors and then you sit back at home and wait for them to send you in orders, you might get some business and you might be really happy with this business. But it's nothing compared to what you should be getting if you manage them correctly. And it goes back to the training process. I'm going through stuff now, which is funny because for 30 years, I've done a lot of this stuff face-to-face. And now what I'm doing is I'm coaching and training people. I've signed up 4 distributors during the Corona period without meeting them face-to-face. I've never done that in my life before. And I'm working with, more Zoom calls and more remote information. It makes me feel a little bit uncertain, but you got to do it, right? You got to find a way to keep life moving. And, so that's sort of an unusual situation right now, but it's all about the methodology and playbooks. Like what I've found is if you have a good playbook for your distributors, you can get them to sell 2 or 3 times as much, right? You can, one book, one manual can increase sales by 100% easily if you put the effort into it, because you're giving them instructions. Every distributor salesperson gets up every morning and has to decide what he wants to sell. And what's he going to sell? He's going to sell the product that he perceives is easiest to make money from. So if you can keep good mind share with the distributor salespeople, he believes that you're going to help him, get money easily. He thinks it's profitable to sell your product, then he's going to sell your product. And you could work with a distributor that has 1,000 products. Nobody's ever going to put any effort into your product, right? So that's the thing. And then it's a matter of, choosing your distributor. You have to balance out between the big distributors. Sometimes it's very attractive. You say, wow, this is the biggest distributor in Saudi Arabia. This is fantastic, but he has 1,000 products. So is he going to give you the right focus on your product? And you don't know that, right? You can try and negotiate it. I like to put these things in my distribution agreements. Again, people will say, well, I signed a distributor agreement. I talked to a guy a while back. He goes, this is great. I just got $1 million order. I said, really? Wow, that's fantastic. And so I talk it through. He goes, yeah, I signed up a distributor and in the agreement, he agreed to give me $1 million order during this year. And I said, so wait, it's in your agreement that, what does that mean? He goes, well, before the end of the year, he has to give me $1 million order. So I said, okay, what's the remedy if he doesn't? He goes, well, what do you mean, what's the remedy? It's in the agreement. I said, so 12 months from now, you can terminate him as your distributor if he doesn't give you $1 million order. Is that what you're saying? So he goes, well, I guess that's, but no, he agreed to give me $1 million order. I said, no, he put it in his agreement, and your remedy for this is you can terminate him. You don't have that. So what he basically did was he signed a piece of paper, which means you can't sell in his territory for the next year. And a year from now, he either gives you an order or he doesn't give you an order, and then you can terminate him. But until, for the next 363 days, you can't terminate him and you can't sell in that market and you don't have a penny out of this. And he was like, oh, he went from being really cheerful to being really upset. And I said, what would have happened if you said in 30 days, you have to train 2 salespeople, and every 30 days going forward, you have to give me 5 reports that say that you've made a sales call. I said, would he have sold product by the end of the year? He goes, well, yeah, if he were doing, 5 sales calls a month with 2 trained salespeople, yeah, by the end of the year, he would have had sales. I said, wouldn't it have been better to put in your agreement the correct activities and not you have to give me a $1 million order over the next 12 months, right? So that's a different way of looking at it if it's going to get you better results.
Got it. So key part is the metrics and what you're following. And you hinted on this is not just selecting the right person, but there's some sort of interaction that you need to be doing using metrics, using information. What kind of frequency and how does that work? It's probably very case specific.
Well, it is. And what you really have to do is make sure that you can present them with a compelling pitch that they want to work with you. Because if you come and you say, well, here's the thing, I want a weekly report, and they don't perceive value, they're just going to tell you to bugger off, right? So what you have to do is you have to say, wow, you're going to make a lot of money off of this. I'm going to help you. But on a quarterly basis, you're going to give me a funnel report, and we're going to go through this, and we're going to talk about your customers. And I would like to see, a monthly written report from your salespeople, just telling me who they're visiting and that they're calling on the right number of people. And it's my expectation, you take a look and you say, okay, there are 400 potential customers in your market, and I would like you to call on all of them within the next 2 years. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that's 200 sales calls, and that's 4 sales calls a week, right? So if you have one person doing a sales call a day, you're good, right? So those are metrics that you can put in your distributor agreement, and then you can talk to the guy. And I'm talking to my distributor sales reps, either me or my regional managers are talking to the reps pretty much every day, right? We know what they're doing, and we're not bugging them because we're also giving them value. We're coaching them, we're giving them good sales enablement tools, we're giving them advice, we're saying, hey, you know what? You're in a market that's very similar to this other market. And in this other market, the sales guy just did something pretty cool. You should try it in your market, and we'll walk them through it. So we are constantly giving them stuff that they perceive as having value, right? And what I want is for these salespeople to make a lot of money. I want the distributors to make a lot of money, and then they're happy. I have good mind share. And I'll tell you what, I get this, I have, I'll walk through a trade show, the big trade shows that I go to in the healthcare field. I'll walk down the hallway and I'll see salespeople who worked for my distributors 20 years ago, and they'll remember me. And they'll say, wow, the year I worked with your product, I bought my first Mercedes, man. I love you. And that's the best feeling possible, because you're giving people tools to really better their lives, and they remember you. They want to sell your product, and they want any product that you handle because they know that you are going to help them make money.
Really, really great way to look at it. Excellent. We've got about 10 minutes left and a couple more questions, and we'll wrap up. You touched on the issue of the pandemic and how it's impacted the world, and you in particular, and how you're doing selling. Could you elaborate more on that? Kind of are there some learnings that
I'll tell you what,
from?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, you asked me about choosing distributors, and I feel really confident with how I do things. What I'm doing now, I'm not that confident with. We're all learning as we go, right? But I'm doing everything I can to keep stuff moving. So I do a lot of video coaching stuff. I have a fair amount of video equipment at home. Nothing fancy, but I can whip out a 3-minute video really easily. So I've put together dozens of little coaching videos, which I can send to my distributor sales reps, right? So I do that. I work with a bunch of different tools like WhatsApp and Voxer. so I can communicate with the sales reps in the field. And what I find is, you know, let's say you're dealing with somebody in the Philippines, you don't have an overlap of working hours that's really good. So if you want to talk to them, you might be doing it at 4 a.m. And I don't necessarily want to do that every day, but if I use something like Voxer, I can leave them a 30-second video or audio clip, send it to them. They hear it a few hours later, and then they return, and we can have a conversation like that. It's really, really easy. Those are some of the things I'm doing. I've interviewed, I'm in the process of hiring a couple of regional sales managers without having met them. I've never done that before. And what I did was, so I basically sent everybody questions, and I said, okay, send me a video clip answering these 3 questions. And then I went through those and I chose who I wanted to interview. And then I did Zoom video calls with people. And I've done, you know, I've sent them psychological profiling testing remotely and stuff like that. So those are some of the tools I'm using. I have a feeling that a year from now, about half of these things I'm going to continue to use, and about half of them I'm going to stop using, because I do believe that you really do need that face-to-face interaction. There are a lot of reasons why people want to spend time with you to develop rapport, and it's very hard to develop rapport otherwise. On the other hand, can you do coaching and training? Can you do recruitment? All these things, can you do these things remotely and save yourself travel? I think you can. And I think I'll probably shift half or more of my training and coaching and recruiting activities, which is a large part of what I do, right? I think I'm going to be able to shift a lot of that to remote, for the rest of my life.
Got it. Okay. So there's a positive that comes out of all of this.
Yeah.
If you know,
well, and I'm also having dinner with my family a lot more, so that's a positive thing too. Right?
When do you expect to get back on a plane?
I don't know. I'm shocked. So my wife pointed out to me the other day, I was a paratrooper, right? I did jump school when I was 18 and a half. I have never gone more than 60 days without getting on a plane since I was 18. And now I am, you know, I've been 4 or 5 months without getting on a plane, and I don't know when I'm going to get on a plane again. So I don't know. Like, I have no idea what's going on with this. I imagine by the beginning of next year at the latest. I almost got stuck in Pakistan with when all the shutdowns happened. So I basically said, I'm not taking that risk again. I thought I was going to be smarter than everybody. I thought, you know, I had this meeting to do in Pakistan. I thought, I'm going to fly in. I'll wear a mask. I'll wear gloves. I won't touch anything. And then I'll fly out. I'll be okay. And I was this close to getting stuck there for, you know, 3 months in a hotel room in Islamabad. I'm not taking that risk again. So we'll see.
got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe this will take us home. I want to go back to the topic of resources, and in terms of a couple different aspects of it. First of all, the aspect of, you know, that regional managers and even you know, connect up with other people just to brainstorm and to be a resource. You're clearly a resource for them, for the ones that you work for. And so you probably keep a lot of that in your mind in terms of they're kind of there on their own, and they don't have, you know, anybody really to turn to that's doing what they're doing. So you've got to give them kind of the right dose of information on a daily basis. But on the other hand, you also need to have a variety of resources for research and a variety of other things like that. So could you talk a little bit more about, first of all, how you decide what to dose out, and then how do you keep fresh, and how do you access resources to keep your part of it going, so that you're eventually dosing them the proper amount?
Yeah, so I see myself, it's sort of funny. I like to use the word curator. I like to curate information to my team. So what I do, like you said, I parse it out. I'll say, okay, this is a great article on this. I know you're not going to read the whole book, but I think this little piece of information will help you out. And I do that a lot. It's also something that builds value with your distributor salespeople. You know, if they look back and they say, hey, Zach sent me this article on the right type of questions to ask in discovery, they remember you, right? And you're helping them out and you're somebody they respect, etc. So I do stuff like that. Now, how do I get that? I read a lot. I belong to 3 or 4 different groups, like the Global Chamber, for instance. I'm active in the Global Chamber. I'm active in a couple of groups of sales leaders, like the Revenue Collective and the Revenue Genius. So those are really my peer groups. I read probably 20 sales books a year. You know, this year, last year, I haven't taken that many courses, but typically in any given year, I'll take a couple of workshops and a couple of courses. I like to keep those things going because I'll tell you what's really interesting in sales is there's a lot of classic stuff, but you might find some 25-year-old kid who is really, really good at cold calling, who now has a LinkedIn following, and I can learn stuff from him, right? I haven't professionally cold called in 25 years, maybe closer to 30 years. So there are people like that out there who can teach me about, you know, they have ideas about writing emails or making calls or, you know, the subject line of your email, stuff like that. I can always learn stuff like that. And, you know, I'm always looking for things, not necessarily from sales. Like, for instance, my holy grail for a few years was trying to do better note taking because I felt that salespeople don't do very well at note taking. So you're in an hour-long meeting and you capture 50 words. If you can capture more information, your follow-up is going to be better, right? And that's a silly little thing. You know, literally people would laugh at me over how much I tried to improve that. But I believe that those little incremental changes are very helpful. And I spent a crazy amount of my time reading and studying those type of things to improve my game. That's how, you know, that's how I keep going.
Awesome. Well, in closing, could you just take a minute or two and kind of wrap up, talk about the book,
Yep.
talk about the resources
Yep.
that you have?
So
and
I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website. It's called globalsalesmentor.com. But if you go to Zach Selch on LinkedIn, you can connect to everything I have. I have a speaker site. I do a fair amount of public speaking. It's called www.themostinterestingsalesmanintheworld.com. But it also links up to my LinkedIn. And really, if you reach out to me, if you just have a question or something, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat. I chat with people all the time. I chat with people about their careers all the time, or, you know, these questions about finding a distributor, that type of thing. Happy to chat with you. But that said, you know, I am available for coaching. I'm available for, you know, if you want to set up a distribution organization and you don't know how to do it, talk to me. We can work something out. I can do it for you. I can guide you. I can be there so you can call me once a week and talk about what you're not sure about, that kind of thing. So those type of things are available. Probably in September or October, I'm going to make available to the Global Chamber my book at probably close to a 90% discount for a 2-week period. And, you know, then just please buy my book. I really think I've read a bunch of books out there on international growth. There's nothing quite like it. You know, you get people who have done this for a couple of years and then they write a book. It's going to be a little bit different. I go really in depth. This is meant to be a practical manual for an international sales manager.
Oh, that's awesome. Really looking forward to it. Really loved the last hour chatting with you. Brought back
Me
some
too. It's been a
memories
lot
for
of fun,
me.
Doug.
We should have met 30 years ago. That would have been I would have enjoyed.
I'll tell you what, you never know. We might have met in the airport bars sometime and just don't remember. You never know, right?
We probably undoubtedly passed in an airport somewhere. There's no question.
Probably.
You haven't had a beard that whole time, though, have you?
No, and this is the biggest beard I've ever had. My wife refuses to let me trim it myself because I screw it up. So she's like, just wait until the end of the shut-in, and then you can get a haircut. So.
Oh my goodness. So hopefully it doesn't get too much longer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I hope not.
Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate
Pleasure.
your support.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Really, all your collaboration is awesome. So thanks everybody for watching. Watch for the podcast and the recording, and stay in touch with Global Chamber to grow your business internationally. Thank you, Zach.
Yep.
Have a good one.
All right.